All right, so here we've got our half scale pattern, and of course we need to make it into full scale so that we can fit it on one of the bigger dummies and really see how it's going to work as a human size garment. So we've got our piece here, and I've just marked a little mark in the middle here, halfway down, and got that as a reference point onto my bigger sheet of paper as well. And really, all we're doing, we have to take lots of different measurements along the outline here, and then we measure that, and then we double that measurement, and that'll make it up to full scale. So it's different from grading. Grading is when you find other sizes, and you're usually only going up, 5 centimeter increments. But this is literally doubling the whole thing. So our waist is 34 centimeters, and that's going to go up to 68 centimeters. So like we're doubling all the measurements. So don't confuse it with grading because it's not. All right, so we start here. Sorry, Libby, you want to ask something?
Point's is that where you go from for the?
It's just a random point, yeah, in the middle. If you had your point up here near the neck, then like this measurement would be double, but then you'd have to measure from here all the way down to that point and then double that again down there. So I've just got, because I knew that I needed to double this length, so I've given myself like just a bit over double the length of the pattern piece that I'm working for. And I've started in the middle and the middle of the pattern here, knowing that everything's going out from that direction there. Okay, so I measure from that center point up here, and you might not be able to see that, but that's 19 centimeters there. So from that point, and we're using the outside edges as well. Like I said before, we have a half centimeter seam allowance included, so we want to double that. So if we include the seam allowance and then double the measurement, on the full scale one, it'll take our seam allowance from half a centimetre to up to 1 centimetre in full scale. So that's pretty handy. So it means that you can have seam allowances included, in your half scale. So then you take another measurement from the tip there up to 19 centimetres there, and you put a little mark. Is that easy enough to see,
yeah.
Libby? Yep, cool. All right, now you'll have to, if you're just doing a straight line, you only need a point at each end. If you're doing a curve though, you need points around the curve to recreate that curve nicely. So from the center up, I put a point there, and that's taken up to this point. I'm not going to say what the measurements are because that's going to take us all day. So yep, just doubling it. So then I go over to the next one here, and then double that measurement. And then it's marked up here, and be very precise with when you're measuring this as well. Don't just play it by ear and go, oh yeah, that looks good enough. Like the idea is that you want a good accurate pattern in full scale, and if you've made it so that these pattern pieces fit together, if you do it properly, then automatically the full scale pieces are going to fit together as well. So you're always keeping the end of the ruler on the center there, and you could do it so that you measure from here to here, and then double that measurement, and then use the ruler out. You could do that. Otherwise, if you could go through that point, and you could mark a little point there, and then measure from there.
I think it's easier.
Actually, yeah, double it. Yeah,
really is,
good point. And then, and so we're up to the corner here. So keep it there. Find out what that measurement is and double it. We've got our corner point up there. And then, because like I said, this is a straight line, so we only need a point at each end. We don't need points along the way because that's just wasting time. So out through the corner, and keep checking back at this point as well to make sure that the end of the ruler is, because you start to move it and it can swing it out a couple of millimeters. So 22 up to 24, 44. And then we've got points around our armhole, so you can see these that I've made. And then, yeah, so we'd continue that process down and then along the bottom as well. We also need to transfer these points for our tucks as well. So we've got a corner point here. So we're going to measure from that. So that's 5.4, and we're going to take that up to 10.8. So going from this point through the end point there, and
So you're not actually keeping the ruler straight, you're just following that from going out from that centre point that you marked
exactly.
in a straight line.
And so then I've got that point there. And so this is, I'm using my tailor's awl because we have to put a point through this pattern so that when we lift it up we can see it on the other side. Okay, this one here, that's 8 centimeters, so that takes us up to 16, and this one does actually go off the paper, but we'll still use our tailor's awl. And then at the bottom here, so we've got 6.7, which is 13.4. And obviously the smaller the increments you're dealing with, the more accurate you have to be as well. So that's 8.9, which is 18 point...
17.8.
17.8.
Handy mathematician.
Yep. Okay, so then we'll just lift this up here, and then we can draw in these points. And then when we've got these in place now, so we need as a reference, when we cut this out in fabric, we'll come in from that corner, we'll come down 5 millimeters and in 5 millimeters.
And this is an industry technique, and it's mainly used for when you have multiple layers of fabric. It's just easier if you put a drill hole through the fabric, multiple layers of fabric, rather than having to, use a pin and chalk. If you're making one garment, of course, you can just mark it with a pin and chalk.
But yes,
we're trying to teach you industry.
If you're cutting
practice.
multiples.
Yeah.
So put a little cross there, and so these will be the drill holes that we'll use, and that way you use those as a reference when you line them up, but then you sew over the top of them so that you won't see those drill holes. They'll be tucked in underneath. So this is the pattern that I've created. You can see that my marks that I was just showing you before, how I've joined all of those together. And if you find along the way that, if this here, from here down to here, you'd do it as a straight line, but if you wanted to put a bit more curve on it, you could potentially add another point in. So, because you'll need more points around curves than, like I said, with straight lines. The other thing you can do too is, this is the line that was created, and I've drawn that. Remember that line too, the new line that we've created is the outside of the pattern piece, and then you can draw in your 1 centimeter seam allowances back from that point. So it's a little bit different to working with the blocks, but the thing is, you have to remember, don't use that line and then add seam allowances onto it. The seam allowances are already included, and that's why, like on our half scales, I always draw in the seam allowances, so I know seam allowances are included, and if I double that, I'm going to double the seam allowance, and it's already included in the full scale. I don't have to add more to it. The other thing you can do too, you can use one of these French curves if you're playing with an armhole, and you're not quite sure about the shape. You can just have a little, like you could maybe redraw the armhole. So this looks a little bit like, it looks slightly pointy there, so maybe, and I obviously should have done this before I cut it out.
Well, sometimes you get slightly square armholes though in the front.
Yeah, so that curve's a little bit nicer, but if I wanted to make that change on this pattern piece now, then I'd have to add a little bit more paper on there. So this thing here. This is what you do, like when you've got all this
Oh, yeah.
laid up, and you can see the points. So potentially there, and you can see there's just little bits of difference along the way, but that's quite a nice armhole there. So it's not it's not imperative that you follow. The half scale is always going to be a guide, and the thing is, this is for the first time you're doing this in full scale, so you still need to toile it, and then you'll tweak along the way. Same with the the shoulder, draw that in, and then just have a look at your your back neck as well. Sorry. So
Needs to be square to the back.
yeah, so this needs to be a right angle here, but yeah, you can play with that shape. So I've gone around, I've drawn in the seam allowances, which are already included, and the back pattern, remember, it already had a seam allowance down the centre back, so that's turned into a 1 centimetre, which means that you've only got enough seam allowance there for an invisible zip, but that's generally what we use these days anyway. And you can see the marks for the tuck and the drill holes that you'll match up for when you're sewing the tuck together. And we've got a notch on the side seam halfway down because it's quite a long side seam. This is our front here. So you can see seam allowance is included. The tucks that I've drawn in for the front. The centre front is on the fold. So, so write that on, centre front, our CF fold in my rather scrappy writing.
That grain line you've drawn on, that's pretty universal. So if you can't read English, it's still understood by anyone dealing with this sort of thing in the industry, isn't it?
Yeah, so the centre front and the centre back are generally the grain lines that you use.
With the arrows pointing into the centre front fold.
And even with this back here, you could draw a separate seam allowance, a separate grain line. But what I do sometimes is literally just draw the arrows on the stitch line of the centre back, and then people can see that that's where the grain line is. So here we've got our full scale. So we've made our full scale pattern, seam allowances and the tuck, centre front on the fold. And this is how it's translated into calico. So centre front on the fold, so all one piece of fabric going across. You can see how we've got our tucks here, and we've actually sewn the tucks in, so it's literally a line of sewing from here to here, and then that holds the tuck in the back there. So like I said, in the half scale, we can still, that one's pinned, so you can still have a look to see whether you might like it tucked towards the centre front, towards the centre back. It won't change the fit at all, it's just a bit of a different look. Like I said, this is flatter, and then you've got like slightly more fullness towards the side. So the neckline has a seam allowance on it, and I just thought we'd put a seam allowance on it to keep it consistent. It is a 1 centimetre seam allowance. Generally we have 0.6 around the neckline, but so that's something you can alter. And the reason that I've just added a seam allowance there is because you still have to design the neckline. Like this as a neckline is pretty ordinary. It's sort of saggy down in the front, but neat, on either side of the neck. So, like if I was doing something like this, I'd probably scoop the neckline out more. And at that point, that's when I would, get my design line for the neckline and then add the 6mm seam onto that and follow that through on the back as well. That pulling that we had on the half scale has pretty much gone away, which is good. So we don't have to worry about that. And then our back here, and again with the tucks in the back, these tucks are going towards the side seam, but they could go, towards the centre back as well.
They look very low there. Are they still on the waist?
They should be.
Anyway, that's the sort of thing that you can change.
Yeah, exactly.
If
So
you're not happy with the position of it, you can move it around at this point.
And that's why you need to make it up in full scale, and you can actually step away from it and get an idea of, what it's looking like. And again, like this style is very basic, and it probably would have been easier to use the dartless block,
Yeah.
you know, to get to this point than to model it on the dummy. But it's just the process that we needed to go through and show you how to get from that half scale pattern up to a full scale pattern. And again, like with the armholes, have a 1 centimetre seam allowance around them. If you're putting a sleeve into it, that's fine. If you're just finishing off the armhole, if you're binding it, then you might actually want to take the seam allowance off altogether and have no seam allowance around the armhole so the binding fits over the top of it. Yeah, so you can play with the position of these tucks. You could maybe think about, you know, it might be pretty cool, you know, if you had the tucks going this way, you know, you could actually maybe even put a pocket in there. So, you know, like your hand would go in here and there'd be a pocket inside the tuck. That might be a fun idea. But really, you know, like this is just the first stage of the full scale, you know, and then you have to really think about more about how, you know, the design of the garment is going to evolve